All right, so welcome everybody to Science Under the Virtual Stars first edition. We've posted a talk from Christina Balentine, and you're now at the Q&A session. We're going to start off with one or two questions from our bank, and then we'll go ahead and open it up to everybody. But just to remind everyone, tonight's speaker or Q&A answerer is Christina Balentine from originally the University of Texas at Austin, and now she is transferred up. Is it UConn where you actually are?
Yeah, physically, but I'm still a UT student.
Okay, she's physically up at UConn with her advisor, but she's still a UT student. She's a fifth year EEB student, and yeah, she studies human evolution and uses ancient DNA to answer some of those questions. So to start things off, where do you actually find ancient human DNA?
That is an excellent question. We find it from the remains of humans that lived in the past. So these could be the physical remains of the people themselves. The best sources of ancient DNA are actually from the teeth, usually the molars. The teeth roots have a high source of DNA, and I think it's the ocular bone, if I remember correctly. There's a bone in your temporal, in the area near your ear, that is a very, very dense bone where your the housing of your eardrum is. And those are the highest sources of ancient DNA that we can get from human skeletal remains. But you can also get DNA from other parts of the human skeleton, as long as it's like very dense, thick bone. Because if it's not very dense, then it's difficult, or like the DNA would be subject to contamination and more degradation, because ancient DNA is highly degraded. It's broken up into lots of pieces. So we need, in order to have a good source of ancient DNA, it has to be protected, ideally protected from the elements, or like bacteria getting in there and getting bacteria DNA all over the place. So yeah, human skeletal remains, but we can also get human ancient DNA from the soil in where people have lived, which is pretty amazing, and is actually something that is very, like, the methods for getting ancient DNA from the ground in which people have lived on is a very new method, but people are figuring out a way to do it, to find these little fragments of DNA in the soil from people have left behind from their wastes from living in a region. So those are the two main places.
Okay, so you said that the DNA is heavily degraded, meaning it's in small pieces. Why is that problematic? Or why is that considered degraded?
So it's considered degraded because our DNA in our bodies are made up of long, long stretches. And when an organism dies, DNA is part of that living organism. So as the body breaks down, the tissues start breaking down, bacteria come in to help decompose the body. The cell walls around your cells, which and the membranes of the nucleus where the DNA is stored, those slowly start to break down, and different things can happen to the DNA. For example, if DNA is exposed to water, it will break the bonds between the different bases within the molecules. So if you've got your several bases, A, T, G, C, a process called hydrolysis can break the bonds between those bases, causing it to fragment. The way I like to think of DNA fragmentation is kind of like two strands of dried spaghetti. So when you take two strands of spaghetti, because DNA is double-stranded, if you hold them together and break them, they're not, unless you are really, really careful, they're not going to break evenly. So that's kind of like a side to your question, but that's how we can help to identify DNA in our data, is by seeing broken pieces of DNA where one strand is hanging, I don't know how to do this, is like overhanging the other. So like if my sleeve was the end of the DNA, they wouldn't be completely lined up, broken perfectly. There would be like an offset. So processes such as hydrolysis, oxidation, when the molecule is exposed to oxygen, it can break up into pieces. Bacteria can come in and break down the molecules. And those are the main things that break it up and make it very hard to recover, because just the way our methods currently work, it's better at picking out long pieces of DNA from a bunch of other cellular material as opposed to small pieces. But it is possible, and we are able to do it.
That's cool. So the smaller the DNA fragment, the harder it is to line up and get any useful information from it. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think we'll do one more. So what makes DNA ancient? Where's the cutoff?
Oh, so it depends on who you talk to and where you go, but in the United States, I believe the cutoff for ancient DNA is around the same time frame as the cutoff for archaeology. What is considered archaeological material is 50 years old.
So some of our relatives or people that we know, their DNA would be considered ancient?
Only in the sense that the body and the molecules have not been living for those 50 years. So you have to take the precautions that are necessary for ancient DNA research. I think I mentioned it in my talk. It's been a week, but all of the different precautions of wearing a suit and trying not to get our own DNA involved in the process. In that sense, in like a scientific sense, it's considered ancient DNA, but I don't know.
So like deceased for at least 50 years, not living for 50 years.
Sorry. Yes. Good clarification. Deceased.
Yeah, because I was wondering, years. Like my parents who are approaching their 60s, if that's considered ancient DNA or not.
Don't tell them that, no.
I would never. I would never.
Gotta be dead for that long.
All right, I lied. We'll do one more, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. So what's the oldest human DNA?
Are you going to ask me the oldest one?
No.
Oh, because I was going to say on this.
Yes, I was.
On the same vein, we can talk about that. So oldest ancient DNA that we found for hominins, which are our cousins, our ancestors, is 430,000 years ago. So at the time Neanderthals were living in Europe, this DNA comes from some hominins that were found incredibly preserved in Spain. And they are not Neanderthals and they're not Denisovans. They have ancestry from both, and both groups of hominins. So that's the oldest human ancient DNA. The general upper limit of ancient DNA is 400,000 to 1 million. Pretty much any DNA after 1 million is 1 million years we haven't been able to recover. So far, the oldest confirmed DNA that has been recovered was from, I think, bacteria in permafrost, so up in the Arctic, from 700,000 years ago.
Wow, that's pretty old. So at this point, we have a few people who have joined us, which is incredible. We didn't know how many might or might not actually show up. If anybody would like to ask a question to Christina, she's more than happy to answer anything and everything you guys might have for her. So feel free to unmute yourself. If you cannot, send something in the chat, and then we can unmute you, and then you may ask a question.
And you're welcome to just ask in the chat too if you don't feel like unmuting yourself. And I'm sorry you're getting like random shots of my cat's tail because he must be involved in everything.
Present at all times. It's like that silence after a talk where somebody doesn't want to be the first person, but then as soon as somebody asks a question, there's like 40 and you get out of there 10 minutes after it was supposed to be finished. It's also unclear how, if everybody is actually with their phones at the moment, they might have had to walk away. I don't mind hanging on for a little bit longer.
The 602 number is my dad, so he might not ask a question.
Okay. So I believe we have one person who is not directly associated with the speaker or UT Austin. Fantastic.
Can I ask a question, Christina?
Yes.
Please.
Sorry.
So,
Kitty cat's
no,
fine.
it's fine. I think a lot of people, given, the times, are very curious about human evolution now. So, is there evolution that's still happening in humans, even though we, have controlled for diseases and things like that? Is there still ongoing human evolution? And also, what effects do you think things like climate change might have on human evolution?
That's a really good question. I have to say that 100% humans are still evolving, but the thing is with evolution, and it's a common misconception, we will never be able to observe these changes that occur from evolution, from the process of evolution, in our lifetime, in our children's lifetime, in our children's children's lifetime, or in our children's 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 lifetime. I think that's enough. Evolution is an extremely slow process for the most part. Obviously, there's some times where an absolute catastrophic event happens and the population is has to change, like just the way things happen, change happens rapidly. But for the most part, especially now that we, as you said, we are controlling for diseases that used to kill us, kill off humans more, the evolution that we have seen in the past of, like, for example, malaria resistance with sickle cell trait, the more we are able to get anti-malaria drugs into the regions that are prevalent with malaria, the less need there is for this evolutionary trait to be in place. So in the sense, evolution will not be occurring for that, but that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be something else occurring, so other changes that just over hundreds of generations, thousands of generations, causes there to be change in our population, in the genetics of humankind. I have no idea what that would look like. I vaguely remember watching a program years ago talking about this topic, and there was a brilliant scientist on there who I think had some great ideas. But yeah, the exact form and shape of human evolution is hard to say because it takes thousands of generations for it to happen. So if we were able to take a snapshot now of our genetics, which we have through the Human Genome Project and by sequencing human genomes, and then 100,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now even, look at it again, there would definitely be differences. But what those differences look like, I couldn't guess. I feel like there's a second part to your question. Was it the climate change?
Yeah, it was just, would there be some kind of evolutionary effects of climate change in human genomes in thousands of years,
Yeah, possibly. It depends on a lot of factors. I think it depends on how detrimental climate change is to all of humankind. It depends on if there's a random mutation that occurs in humans that ends up getting passed on to the generation to generations in the future that is somehow beneficial as like an adaptive evolution. But there's also, with again, not trying to be like depressing or anything, but populations like up in the Arctic who are experiencing climate change worse than any other population in the world currently. We can see evolution in the form of people not being able to maintain living in these regions because they're uninhabitable, and they don't have the financial or economic means to move to a different location. So people end up having fewer children, and then these populations, these groups, just eventually we would not see them in that region anymore. And those, if you don't have children, then the genetic information doesn't get passed on into the future. So we would be losing genetic information and genetic variation, not information, but genetic variation in that sense. So I think it's super important for us, like there's absolutely no reason for any group of humans or any humans on the planet to suffer so direly from something that's very easily reversible, or at least like able to be halted. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
We very well may be out of questions.
Well, there was the lactase one that Anne was curious about.
Well, then get it.
Okay. So I'm going to try to read this question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to ask the question?
Yeah, go for it.
So, you talked in your talk, you talked about how, how natural selection works in populations, and how in order for a trait or something to be propagated through future generations, or for evolution to happen, you have to see either differential survival or reproduction of those individuals. And so my question was, you talked about the lactase gene, or the ability to digest lactose, and it being quite prevalent in certain human populations across the globe that have dairy and stuff like that. And my question is just, thinking about how that gene or that mutation in that gene evolves. How is it possible for that to happen? Does that mean that the lactase gene is somehow allowing people to survive better or reproduce more back when it initially appeared in the population? Just like, how does something like that appear and persist when it may not be? It's just not an obvious, affecting survival kind of trait. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. It doesn't seem like if you're able to digest lactose, you're gonna just be able to survive better. But I think in a slight way, you can. And I think it's a lot more nuanced than the traditional framework of something to be adaptive. It has to, a trait has to directly and strongly, and like the implication for that is that it strongly affects survival or reproduction. I think it can be a little bit more lax, like it can be helpful, but it doesn't have to necessarily be something that is life or death. In the case of the lactase persistence, which is lactose tolerance, basically it's the persistence of the enzyme that can digest the sugar lactose that's found in milk. From what I understand is, if you are a pastoralist, a person back 10,000 years ago, moving around throughout the desert or throughout the plain, throughout the mountains or wherever in Europe, and it's getting to be winter and there isn't a lot of food stuff around. If you have a female dairy animal, that can provide you milk to drink. It's a good source of protein and calcium and other nutrients that can help you survive times of what would otherwise be famine. So in a way, if you're able to digest dairy, then when times get hard, you can drink your animal's milk and be able to survive and hopefully have offspring, and maybe have more offspring as a result. And there's something interesting about the LCT gene, which is the one that has to do with lactase persistence. I don't know the biochemistry behind it, but because this has happened 3 times in 3 different parts of the world independently from one another. So this wasn't a case of someone in Africa started drinking milk, this mutation arose, they could digest milk, and then they moved around the world. It was completely independent in 3 different regions of the world that just started digesting or started drinking milk. So it's a cool gene. There's very few examples of that kind of stuff happening within humans in one gene.
Thank you so much. That was great.
You're welcome.
We had someone for a moment.
I saw that.
We
And they
had
left.
someone for a moment. Does anybody have any questions?
Kyle, can you just hang on 1 second? It looks like somebody messaged me
Yeah.
on the Facebook group. Just a sec.
I'll say I'm not going anywhere.
Me either.
I am impressed we made it a half hour thus far, though. That's a little promising.
Yeah. And there's the questions from the Google form that was sent to me earlier this evening that I can go through as well if
Okay.
no one else has some questions.
Yeah, I think this person just didn't realize that they need to sign in with an email address.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe they will join us.
Great. Well, in the meantime,
Were they kicked?
No, they just commented on the post on Facebook and said, like, I am not able to get in without an email. Can you help? Yeah.
I understand.
While we wait, see if anyone else joins. Someone had asked on the Google form, where do you look for ancient DNA? How do you find it? I think I kind of hinted on this at the beginning, but it's mostly archaeological sites or places where other archaeologists are doing excavations and find human remains. So sometimes that's the geneticists themselves are out there. One of the women in my lab is an archaeologist first, geneticist second, and she excavates all of the skeletal remains that she extracts DNA from. I, on the other hand, am not good in the outdoors, so I stay in the lab and I collaborate with people.
So, Christina, I do have a question. This is slightly unrelated to the topic. When the meeting was made, were you able to change the option that allows non-UT affiliated people in? Okay, so
Yes.
then, so some people are apparently having some email issues, but
yeah, you're just
if you've
supposed
activated that, then it does. Then I'm not sure how we resolve that.
Yeah, you just need to have an email account with Zoom, and it should be free, I assume, to have just a plain email account. Yeah, I'd mentioned that in the post to the event, but it can be missed easily.
There's a lot of moving parts right now.
Yes.
I personally did not get my tour of Brackenridge today, so I'm going to have to go figure out how I can get that. I believe it's right next to your video, though, so.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a really great tour. Colin did a fantastic job.
Good.
I learned a lot that I did not previously know, even though I had an on-ground tour there when we were wee little first years.
That was a minute ago, wasn't it?
Let's not talk about that. Another question that I've got here is, can eye color be explained through adaptation? And yes, kind of, it can. I did some quick Googling since I wasn't sure the answer to this when I saw this question. And according to some research that I found, it looks like eye color and skin color are very closely connected genetically. And as I talked about in the talk, when people moved out of Africa and started living at higher elevations, and there wasn't as strong natural selection acting on darker skin tones. In fact, it was more helpful to have lighter skin tones. Scientists think it's plausible that there was a similar less selection on having dark brown eye color. So initially it was thought that all hominins had dark brown or black eye color. And as we moved out of Africa, that selection wasn't as strong. So lighter colored eyes, blues and greens, and hazels started happening. And a fun random side fact is, through genetics, we have extrapolated that Neanderthals most likely had mostly blue and green eyes with either red or brown hair and freckles, and were very light-skinned. Another question I have here is about the drinking of arsenic. They're amazed that people can adapt to drinking low levels of arsenic. Are there trade-offs to be able to do this? Are the people just as healthy? I took a quick glance at the journal article about that, and it didn't say one way or another. It mostly was focused on those groups of people better metabolize the arsenic. So it doesn't directly affect their bodies. Their bodies can break it down and expel it more effectively. So as far as I could tell, there aren't any trade-offs, and people are just as healthy in that respect. There are more socioeconomic issues that are at play that cause people in those regions likely to not be very healthy because of exploitation of the land and exploitation of the people.
I believe that might actually be the end of our current questions. Yes. Do we have any others written down at the moment?
There was one more, which I definitely would like to talk about, unless someone else wants to jump in real quickly.
Yeah, that's what we'll see. Is there anybody who has joined us either recently or has been here for a while that would like to ask a question for Christina? All right. Christina, what was that question?
Okay. Interesting. I'm also hearing from my family that they weren't able to access either. It says it's only for authorized attendees, but it says that she's here.
Yeah, I wonder if the phones are a little different.
Yeah. Thank you all for being cool with our figuring out how this works. Okay, last question that I've got written down that someone submitted. I'm wondering about the ethics of testing on humans. Can you talk about how to ethically work on genetics in humans? Yes, I can. And I would be happy to, and I will try not to go on for too long. I'm going to first talk about the ethics of testing on living humans. I assume that's what you are referring to, but it's also important to consider the ethics of working on the remains of deceased humans. So when you're working with living humans, it's important to, every university, every research project in the United States has to go through what's called an institutional review board. So you have to propose your research to these experts in human ethics and human research ethics, and work with them to create a research plan that ensures no harm is done to the people you are working with, and that there is a benefit to society as a whole, as well as the people that you are working with. All of this comes initially from the Nuremberg trials from the horrendous experiments that Nazis carried out on their prisoners. And we, in the United States, have developed numerous codes, the name of which is not coming to me, but they're these long, detailed ethical guidelines for working with humans. Some key aspects of those are informed consent. You have to be explicit with the people you are working with as to what your research is about, what you are going to do with the data, information, in my case, the DNA that is done and is going to be done, and you can do no more than that. And that is just from the legal side of things, which doesn't necessarily cover all the ethics. So I work mostly with indigenous people I personally work mostly with those living in South America, but my lab group with Deborah Bolnick works in North, Central, and South America with indigenous groups. And indigenous groups have been greatly negatively affected by research that Western academia has conducted. For example, at my alma mater, Arizona State University, some blood samples were collected from a Native American tribe, the Havasupai. I think it was back in the early 2000s, for some population history research. I'm not getting that quite right. Basically, there was some very specific research that they were going to do with these blood samples. And what ended up happening was the researchers went against the informed consent and did research on diabetes risk without the Native Americans who had donated those samples, without their knowledge. And they got grants for this work and made a profit, both financially and career-wise. And it was a major scandal for Arizona State University, as it should have been. And it kind of set a precedent. Like we've known for years that scientists aren't great at working with indigenous groups, especially in my other field of anthropology, but we are slowly starting to work hard and collaborate directly with the indigenous groups that we are studying, and to answer questions that they find interesting, to answer questions that will help their groups, and all of that. So there's a lot more, and I could go into it even further, but I'm going to leave that there for working with living human populations. When it comes to working with ancient DNA samples, skeletal remains of humans that lived 50 to 10,000 years ago, there is no legal ethical standard for those. However, especially in the Americas, we try to work with the indigenous groups who are either descendant from the people or live nearby and are willing to be stewards of the people who are deceased, and not exploiting those human remains. It's different in Europe with ancient DNA because there's not the history of exploitation within Europe as there is between European colonists and indigenous people in the Americas. Similar in Asia and in Africa as well. But every region has its own specifics where the researchers themselves are trying to work on perfecting ethical guidelines to make sure that no harm is done to people living there.
Excellent. I think we'll open it up for one last round of questions, and then we might dismiss for the evening. Last chance. Would anybody like to ask a question? That's all right. Also, in the future, for those that are here, we are still going to get these bugs worked out, and hopefully we can have this be a little more smooth in the future. But thank you, Christina, for taking the time to make your talk, record it, upload it, and be present for questions from us and the community.
Of course.
Thank you very much, Christina.
Thank you.
I like the clap emoticon.
Yes.
Excellent.